Hello to everyone coming in. We're going to wait just a minute to give plenty of people time to get in, and then we'll get started. Hi, and welcome everyone this evening. My name is Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities at the University of Miami, and I'll be starting off this evening with just a couple of announcements about future events and about the setup of this particular event. This book talk is part of an ongoing series of book talks by faculty at the University of Miami. We have 10 this year. The next one is going to be by Melvin Butler in the Music School on November 18th at this time. And it will be on his book, Island Gospel, Pentecostal Music and Identity in Jamaica and the US. Slightly nearer the time, in 2 weeks on Thursday instead of Wednesday, and at 7 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock, we'll have one of our Stanford online speakers. That'll be Mary Beth Norton, a past president of the American Historical Association, and as that suggests, a major US historian. And she'll be talking about 1774, the long year of revolution. In terms of this evening's talk, I'll be turning it over to an introducer in just a minute, but if you have any questions, what you'll want to do is go down to the bottom, hover over the Q&A, and you can type that in. You can type in questions at any time, although of course we'll hold those off until the end. We'll also be providing on the chat, which is the way we can get to you, we'll be providing a link to Books and Books where you can purchase the book that we'll be discussing tonight by Christina Lane. And to introduce Professor Lane, I'll turn it over to Professor Kontaxis in the School of Communication. So thanks.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Meg, for inviting me to introduce tonight's guest. It's an honor and a pleasure. I've known her for a while, and I'm going to start with a little personal fact. I've met Christina in my first teaching job ever, and we've been colleagues since then. That's a long time ago, with I think a break of a year or two before she joined me at the University of Miami. So it's been a great ride, and I'm looking forward to see what's up next. So tonight's speaker is a chair and associate professor of the Department of Cinematic Arts in the School of Communication. She holds an MA in Women's Studies from the Ohio State University and received her PhD in Critical and Cultural Theory from the Radio, TV, Film Department at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research interests include film authorship, history, cultural studies, women's and gender studies, and historiography. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses, including History of International Cinema, Directors, Women, Media, and Popular Culture, Aesthetics and Analysis, Television Genre, and Pedagogy. She's the recipient of 6 Provost Research Awards and 6 School of Communication Research and Creative Activity Awards, and the 2007 Provost Award for Excellence in Teaching. She's also the director for the School of Communication Herrick Center for Motion Picture Studies, where she oversees a collection of 2,500 film and television titles and collaborates on initiatives to facilitate the study of film and culture in South Florida. She's president of the University Film and Video Association, and she's on the board of the academic association called Women and Film History International, and a member of the Women Film Critics Circle. And she has provided commentary to such outlets as NPR, Airmail, Crime Reads, and the Daily Mail. The role of women in Hollywood as storytellers and the power they exercise in their efforts to express themselves have been central to her work. Her first book, Feminist Hollywood From Born in Flames to Point Break, examined a group of women directors who entered commercial Hollywood from the realm of 1970s counter cinema. Her next book, Magnolia, was the first full-length study of the Paul Thomas Anderson film. She has also written on the historical and cultural significance of such pioneering women in film as Carol Lombard, Jodie Foster, Sally Field, Catherine Bigelow, Susan Seidelman, and Sofia Coppola. She has published journal articles in a variety of journals, and I am going to name several of them. Feminist Media Histories, Cinema Journal, the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, Cinephiles, Mississippi Quarterly, and the Journal of Popular Film and TV. She has also written essays for various edited collections, including Hitchcock and Adaptation, Indie Reframed, Women's Filmmaking and Contemporary American Independent Cinema, Feminism Goes to the Movies, Understanding Gender in Contemporary Popular Cinema, Culture, Trauma and Conflict, Cultural Studies Perspectives on War, Hollywood Transgressor, the films of Catherine Bigelow, and Authorship and Film. Her latest book, Phantom Lady, Hollywood producer Joan Harrison, the forgotten woman behind Hitchcock, has been acclaimed by Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Review, Film Comment, Sight and Sound, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Library Journal, in the Starred Review, deemed it a superbly written, absorbing biography of a woman succeeding on her own terms. Leonore Maltin called it a knockout of a book. Phantom Lady inspired a 2-week retrospective in New York City's Film Forum in March, titled The Women Behind Hitchcock, featuring 31 movies shaped by Joan Harrison and Hitchcock's wife, Alma Reville. More recently, both the author and the book were featured on Turner Classic Movies' Noir Alley series with Eddie Mueller this past September. So it's my pleasure. Please join me in welcoming my esteemed colleague and also a successful woman on her own terms, Dr. Christina Lane.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dia. I appreciate the introduction, and I will get you back sometime soon by introducing you somewhere sometime. I really appreciate the introduction. I also appreciate the invitation. So thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Meg. Thank you to the Center for the Humanities for having me here tonight, and thank you to Books and Books as well. I'm going to speak to you. I'm going to show you the book. I'm going to speak to you tonight about Phantom Lady mostly, which is a biography of Joan Harrison, who at the age of 26 years old answered an ad for the secretary for Alfred Hitchcock, an ad that she saw in London. And within just a few years, she became one of his most important screenwriters, had won 2 Academy Awards for his films, and really became one of his most loyal and enduring screenwriters and producers, and worked with him for over 3 decades. So that's her, kind of her sweeping story. But I also wanted to put this in a little bit of context, because this is a real departure from my work, which has previously been mostly academic work. And this is a biography written for a general audience, for a commercial press, and it's a real departure. It's the result basically of a stage that I had a little bit after I got tenure here at the University of Miami, where I was wanting to basically take some more risks and try new directions and expand, my own horizons, and with the support really of my colleagues in the Department of Cinematic Arts, as well as the dean at the time, Greg Shepard, in the School of Communication, and the continued support of Karen Wilkins, the current dean of the School of Communication. I decided to try this, what for me was a really new form of writing. So to try to write biography, but also it's just a completely different voice that I needed to kind of grow into, and also a different kind of storytelling. It was really trying on creative writing, as well as doing this still within the context of what I typically do, which is archival research and historiography. I do interviews, but I was also doing a lot more kind of journalistic interviews. So finding sources, hunting down, people, trying to judge the truthfulness of the people that I was interviewing, looking for their agenda, weighing the information of the sources kind of, against each other. And the other new ground that I was basically exploring was a new marketplace. So I was, again, basically trying to reach a general audience with a commercial press, which meant finding a literary agent, a different kind of proposal writing, selling myself in a new way, and eventually kind of also entering the realm of social media and finding a new, a readership, right? And building that readership out, which is something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if, if people are interested in that aspect of things. But I say that because this is certainly not the kind of book that, I'm not in my third or fourth or fifth biography. So I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about this experience. And then I do have some notes here. So the log line for this book, basically, right? The pitch for this book is that people have said for decades that Joan Harrison would never have been Joan Harrison, without Alfred Hitchcock. So this is a woman who was always described. Whenever anyone talked about Joan Harrison in film history, she was always described as Alfred Hitchcock's secretary. She could never get out of that shadow, no matter how many accomplishments she had. And I'm going, I promise that I'll list them. But she was always his secretary. And so basically the argument that I make through my research is that, I think that we should twist that around, right? Or turn that around. And I do believe that Alfred Hitchcock would have never been Hitchcock, the Hitchcock that we know, without Joan Harrison. But that's a pretty big argument to make. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, obviously, is take someone who's kind of been an appendage, to film history, and take that side story and make it a central story. And the question, I guess, then, in terms of looking at the scholarship on Alfred Hitchcock, and also the scholarship on the women who worked with Alfred Hitchcock, is why would women be so influential? Because the truth is that there have been many women who have influenced Hitchcock's thinking and Hitchcock's work. So why would women be so influential on Alfred Hitchcock? But also, why would women be so marginalized when we think about Hitchcock? Where have they gone, and why have they been so invisible, typically? And there are a lot of reasons for this. And one of the reasons, actually, not kind of aside from the way that we write film history, one of the reasons for this is actually, it has to do with Hitchcock's working methods, which with the way that he wrote scripts the way that he worked on scripts, right? And the way that he tended to develop or conceptualize his films. Because actually, while he might have taken some writing credits or done some writing very early, like in the 1920s, he really wasn't a writer per se. So his usual practice in terms of working with screenwriters was that he would start working with a writer, and daily they would meet in the morning, and they would have just kind of a conversation that was very disarming. So that especially with a new writer, from early in the morning until lunchtime, he would just kind of talk about things that seemed to be nothing about the film. And he might throw in, a scenario or a motif, like an image that he had in mind, somewhere in there. But most writers would come out of that experience thinking that they had done no work, that they really didn't know what movie he was thinking he would make. And then they would go back and to their workspace in the afternoon, and they would kind of type things out and try to plot out something out of that conversation. And producer John Houseman, who worked with Hitchcock in the early 1940s out of David O. Selznick's office, has a quote where he says, working with Hitchcock really meant listening to him talk, listening to his anecdotes, his situations, his characters, his revelations, and the kinds of things that Hitchcock would kind of think up at night and then try out on us during the day. But what Hitchcock was really good at was basically images, right? Or kernel moments. And he would come in and he would kind of put these things out there. He was not good at stringing them together or finding a structure, or really not particularly great at character. So he needed a really good writer who could come in and build it all out, and especially think about like meanings and themes. And he was always best in terms of his films. His best films were always strongest when he had a really good support team. So when he had a great director of photography, a great editor, a great art director, but particularly a really strong writer. And one of the ways that he tended to work in terms of conceptualizing his films in the early stage, because, you know, Hitchcock was known for saying that once the film was written, he was done. You know, he would kind of fall asleep on the set. This was like the idea. So that it was already basically put together and he could just sit there and let it all happen after that. So that the conceptualization and the writing process was the most important part for him. But in that process, he tended to have not just one writer, but a dominant kind of male writer, and then the constant presence of, at first, his wife, Alma Revel, and then eventually a very reliable female voice. And this would be Joan Harrison. And so it would often be one voice, this kind of, you know, male voice, working with and sometimes working against the other, the woman writer. And then Hitchcock as this kind of third voice. And so this triangular writing pattern is fascinating. And it's really important to understanding his films, because when we watch them, especially their gender politics, have so much complexity, right? They have so much nuance, that to dismiss his films as misogynistic, you know, or to look at certain scenes as being violent against women, or as being particularly graphic, for example, really dismisses the way in which there's so much going on. And partly there's so much going on because there are multiple voices, right? There are multiple logics of gender there. So that's a little bit of setup, right? J. Preston Allen, who was the writer, this is a female writer, who wrote Marnie, 1964, starring Tippi Hedren. One of the interesting things that she told me was that Hitchcock actually, she believed, preferred working with women writers. She said if he'd had his choice, he never would have worked with a man, actually. And this was not because he thought that he could say, you know, dominate the woman in the room, but actually the opposite, that he was afraid of men, that he preferred to work with women because he liked to mentor them, he liked to groom them, and he believed in women in terms of promoting them up into powerful positions as producers. And that she believed that sorry, losing my train of thought, that this was a way that women gained power, right, by working with Hitchcock. That that while people often saw him as being in the power position, that she saw herself as essentially having the strongest voice in the writing team. Okay, so to start, right, to fully tell the story, and I know I'm teasing you a little bit because my book is on Joan Harrison, but really to fully tell that story, or any of this, we have to start with Alma Revel, right? So we have to go back to the beginning, which is when Hitchcock meets his wife-to-be, Alma Revel. And this is in 1921. And Alma Revel has actually been working in a studio in London, Twickenham Studios, which is run by famous players Lasky. She joined that studio at the age of 16 years old. So she had 4 years of experience on Hitchcock. When Hitchcock walked in the door, she was 21 and she'd been there for, you know, 4 or so years. And by that time, you know, she had begun working in the editing room as a cutter, right? You know, actually cutting film. By the time that he met her, she'd held positions as an editor, a continuity writer, a second assistant director, an assistant producer, and also the critical role of floor director. At that time, she was also the only person, man or woman, in the British film industry to have held both positions of cutter and continuity supervisor, which means that basically she just had a very holistic perspective on filmmaking, and she was only 22 years old. So he essentially kind of, you know, and I won't tell the whole story, but you can imagine he walks in and he sees her right kind of from across the room, and she catches his eye. And it's not for a few more years that he actually speaks to her. But when they connect, she really brings Hitchcock along in terms of her own thinking about cinema, how to see in pictures, how to guide the audience's perspective. And one can only imagine the conversations that they have about gender point of view, and about men and women's relationships, and about coupling. And so they do work together, actually, before they get married. They travel Europe working together on films, and then they marry in 1927, I believe. But by then they are career filmmakers, right? They're working together, I should say, professionally. So it's at this moment I'll move to 1933, right? So they've been married a few years. They actually have a daughter, Patricia, who's about 7 years old, and they place this ad, right, for a secretary. And this is when, you know, like, enter Joan Harrison. They need an assistant, and partly they need this because Alma has begun to work for other directors. So she's actually branching out professionally, and she needs her own support, right? And at the same time, Hitchcock has actually moved to basically a new studio where he's about to thrive. So he's moved to Lime Grove Studios, and he's about to begin a cycle of films. He might not even know it yet, but he does know that he's on the verge of making a huge change. So he's going to need, again, a great support team. And when he places this ad, he's actually losing a great assistant. And so when Joan Harrison kind of answers the ad, where she is in life is she's an Oxford graduate. She's again 26 years old. She was born in Guildford, Surrey, right, a suburb of London, and she comes from a pretty well-to-do established newspaper family. And when she was growing up, she always thought that she wanted to be a reporter. At least this is what she tells us. And so she had kind of gone to her father, the head of a newspaper, and said, after Oxford, I want to be a reporter, make me, give me a job in your paper. And he said no. So he denied her the opportunity. And he said, if you're a reporter, you're going to basically become a man. Like he told her some pretty nasty things. So she's kind of rebelling. And she's bouncing around between jobs as a typist and a salesgirl, and she's a bachelorette. And she then, kind of stumbles into this job, which is really great for her because she loves the movies, but she also grew up reading true crime, Gothic mysteries, and also going to trials. Like, she would sneak into the Old Bailey, and she really had no fear, so she would watch pretty gruesome stuff in trials. So when she and Hitchcock go out to lunch and she kind of shares who she is, he realizes that he has a great asset. It turns out that she's the worst secretary that he's ever had. Within about a week, he realizes that she can't take dictation, she can't answer the phones, she can't type. But the good news is that she's really terrific at story and character, and sitting in on meetings and helping shape screenplays. And within about a year or two, she's on her way to writing scripts. And again, within 3 years, she's a screenwriter, right? Gaining credits and titles on his screenplays. So I actually think this might be a good time for me I was going to move to some photographs as I move through more of her career. And so I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay. So you can see that, yes? You got that? Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a couple of images, right? Of here's Alma Revel, right, standing right behind Hitchcock, and then also working with Hitchcock. So you can see those origins. And then, And then also just one last shot where you see that Alma was actually publishing, this is like 1923, that Alma was actually publishing advice in the trades on editing and also other things having to do with her own work in England. So Joan Harrison is sitting here. She's also, as I suggest, she's the first Hitchcock blonde. So she's the blonde sitting sitting next to the sleeping Alfred Hitchcock, right? And then you see her also in this picture where she has, she's off to the side. In each photo, she's, on the same side, I guess you would say, to the right. And one of the things that happens as soon as she joins the team is she also becomes part of the family. And she begins to travel with them, and she becomes like an aunt to little Patricia. And some people suggest that she becomes like a daughter to the couple, maybe like a sister to Alma, but also something of a fantasy figure to Hitchcock. So she goes everywhere with them on the weekends, in the evenings, and also, again, holidays, she travels with them. So there's this really interesting dynamic, which I can also discuss later, I guess, in the Q&A. But just to show you, this is basically the kind of mid to late 1930s as they begin to form this team. And in 1939, Alfred Hitchcock is invited to Hollywood, right? And he forms a contract, which eventually becomes long-term. And he makes Rebecca as his first American film. And of course, he takes his family, Alma, Revel, and Patricia, but the only person that he takes professionally that he ensures has a contract is Joan Harrison. So Joan travels with them and actually writes her, on the ship's charter, her name as Joan Hitchcock. And then when they arrive, these are some photos of Joan and Alma writing together, and then also Joan, kind of the second person in, working on the set with Hitchcock. So once they arrive in Hollywood, Hitchcock begins his kind of, American adventure, but also Joan begins her American adventure. And you'll see here that they begin adapting Rebecca on the lot of Selznick's studios. And while some people, again, are kind of picturing her as his secretary, what she really is by now is she's a creative producer, which means that she's helping him from kind of beginning to end, nuts and bolts, get the pictures made. And what happens in 1940 is she actually is the first person to win an Oscar in 2 categories in the same year. So she wins, I should say, get nominated for. She doesn't win, but she's nominated for Best Screenplay for Rebecca, and then also Best Adapted Screenplay for Rebecca, and Best Original Screenplay for Foreign Correspondent, which is something that no one, I think, has actually done since, but definitely had not done then. So she actually begins to make a name for herself, and people want to hire her out from under Hitchcock. So by 1941 or 1942, she's really itching to go solo. She's a little bit tired of all the work that she's done for Hitchcock, and she feels that she's a little bit capped, right? That she's done everything that she can do for him. And she has a lot of ideas. She has a lot of creative, she's yearning for independence. So she leaves Hitchcock, and she spends actually 2 years struggling she writes a lot of screenplays that don't get made. And then she breaks out and has a huge success with this film, which is Phantom Lady, directed by Robert Siodmak, made at Universal. And it's actually known best for elevating kind of the horror movie at Universal. So it not only helps her, it not only is the first huge breakout for Robert Siodmak, and it's known as kind of a gem of noir, but it also helps Universal brand itself in a new way. And I point out the character played by Ella Raines as the secretary character, because this is a film about a secretary turned detective who essentially solves the crime, because people read that character as kind of a projection of Joan Harrison. The style that you see there is basically the style that Harrison would wear, and she would brand herself in Hollywood in terms of women's workday wear. And this is kind of a mirror image of that which she presented for herself, right? Taking a cue from Hitchcock, she actually branded herself as the mistress of suspense. And here you have it again. So this is the way that she essentially circulated, not just as an important, kind of emerging producer, but also as an image that she was very conscious of circulating herself, kind of commercially. That's her standing on top of her house, which she bought the land, she bought the house, but she also helped design the inside and the outside. So this is a woman who liked to be in control. And to move quickly through her career, because one of the things I do want to do is just essentially kind of tell a bit of her story, and then I'm watching the time, try to also give a sense of why this is an intervention, right? What kind of the significance of the scholarship that's here as well. But she really basically is one of 3 women producers in the studio system in the 1940s. She's one of 3 women who are producing films in Hollywood. The other 2 are Virginia Van Up and Harriet Parsons. And Harrison is producing almost exclusively film noirs, and these are now known as really important in terms of advancing what we now call the genre of noir. So these are some examples, but she produces 8 feature films in the 1940s. Ride the Pink Horse is here, They Won't Believe Me, and Nocturne. And then one of the things that happens, and I'm gonna hold off here on the slide for 1 second, is actually she faces a conservative backlash in terms of a gender backlash in the late 1940s, but more importantly, she gets caught up as someone who is threatened by the blacklist. So I won't go into all the details why, but she essentially has to leave the country, and she's exiled, kind of gray listed. So she goes to Europe for several years, and when she feels that it's okay to come back, she goes to New York and she finds a way to produce television. So she's this pioneer in early television, and the first thing that she does is she produces the very first series that features a nurse as the main character, who does this kind of social work role. And this stars Ella Raines, that very same actress we just saw, and Janet Dean, registered nurse. Only 4 episodes still exist that we can find, but it ran for a full season, and it's really quite bizarre as a series, and I highly recommend it. But one of the things that it leads to, because she's proving herself, right, in this new medium, is that when Alfred Hitchcock Presents starts as a TV series in 1955, Harrison joins Hitchcock Presents as the producer. So she produces that show for 10 years, rising to executive producer. And people suggest that, the kind of understanding of Hitchcock is that he was known for his films, and he really was quite a figure, right? Quite well known for them. But it was the TV series that made him a worldwide, in terms of kind of a commercially known figure. And only Joan Harrison could help certify, right, his TV shows one at a time. She understood what a Hitchcock show was and what the Hitchcock brand was. So he really needed her to run that series. Also, it was really, television was her métier. Like, she loved short stories, and she knew how to translate the short story form to the television medium. And I think that's actually one of her most important contributions, and it gets lost in all of this other stuff, right, in the discussion of her films. Okay. Okay, so if we have time, I was going to look actually more closely at some of the importance of the way in which she actually very specifically contributed to the Hitchcock development of his own like late 1930s, early 1940s sensibilities, which are two kind of genres, right? The Gothic femme noir, which is here, as we see with Rebecca, Suspicion, and before that, films in Britain like Sabotage, The Lady Vanishes, Jamaica Inn, which is very much about kind of a woman investigating her own insecurities, but also potential power structures. And the other major genre, which is the serio-comic thriller, which is looking at kind of a couple on the run, or the wrong man who's on a journey of self-exploration and finds himself coupled with a woman who helps him with that. So one of the things that happens is that Harrison is there on the ground, you know, with Hitchcock as these two formulas or genres are emerging. And some people suggest. I think that the assumption has been that Hitchcock developed that on his own, and Harrison kind of was along for the ride, you know, and learned this stuff and then applied it later in her own work. But I really don't think that that's true. I think that Harrison was a huge literary influence on Hitchcock, had been thinking about these things as she went in, right, to his office, and as she developed in that very early months and very early kind of year or two, and that they developed this together, the formulas, the motifs, the ideas, and specifically the way in which, just looking right here, that the importance of you know, kind of feminine objects, trivial, so-called trivial domestic items, you know, were so important to the growing identity of the female character. These are things that Joan Harrison was really obsessed with from the beginning to the end of her career. So I'm not sure that we necessarily have time to look at clips. I'll stop sharing now and come back and kind of take a cue. Oh, okay. So it looks like we do. So I'll just, because actually the clips are super short, and we'll look at a clip from Rebecca. And you know, you might have noticed that just last week, there was a remake from Netflix of Rebecca. It's the 80th anniversary of that film. So Netflix remade Rebecca, and it came out last week. And no one has written a good review. And I saw it and I wouldn't either. So I don't know if you've seen Rebecca, starring Joan Fontaine, Laurence Olivier, but why don't I show it, and then we'll go from there. I just need to close this. If you haven't seen the film, this is basically Joan Fontaine has married a widower who could possibly have murdered his wife. She's not sure. And his wife has a huge hold over the imagination of Joan Fontaine, who is the second Mrs. De Winter. So the first Mrs. De Winter, Rebecca, who we never see, is kind of this ideal feminine, right? And so as Joan Fontaine's character explores this new mansion that she's living in, Manderley, she's basically also confronting her own insecurities and kind of the worst, right, that she feels about herself. So the architectural space becomes psychological space. I'll say that for now. And so I'm sorry. Hold on. Hold on a second. So we need to make sure you've got the full screen. This. And okay. And I need to share the sound here. Share the sound here.
After breakfast.
Is that full screen?
Thank you, Fritz. Mm-hmm. Is anything wrong, madam?
Oh, no. Which way is the morning room?
Oh, it's that door there, on the left.
Oh, yes, thank you. Mrs. De Winter? Oh, I'm afraid you've made a mistake. Mrs. De Winter's been dead for over a year. Oh, I mean... oh.
That was the house telephone, madam. Probably the head gardener wishing instructions.
Did you want to see me, Mrs. Danvers?
Mr. De Winter informed me that his sister, Mrs. Lacey, and Major Lacey are expected for luncheon. I'd like to know if you approve of the menu.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's very suitable, very nice indeed.
You notice, madam, that I've left a blank space for the sauce. Mrs. De Winter was most particular about sauces.
Let's have whatever you think that Mrs. De Winter would have ordered.
Thank you, madam. When you've finished your letters, Robert will take them to the post.
My letters? Oh, yes, of course. Thank you, Mrs. Danvers.
Okay.
How are you, Fit?
Oh, let me stop the. Okay. And I need to come back. Hi. Okay. Hi. So, right. So one of the things that's going on there is that our character, who's unnamed, she's unnamed in the novel and she's unnamed in the film. So she's actually so willing to kind of annihilate herself. Basically, she's willing to do away with herself. By the end of the film, she's experiencing this serious identity crisis, right? And that's why when she picks up the phone and she says, you know, oh, Mrs. De Winter, she's not here. It's this close call with realizing that she also is not quite sure, right, who she is. And she's having this really interesting relationship with the ideal image of Rebecca, because she's also potentially attracted to this image of Rebecca, like romantically or sexually or something. They play with this as well. But one of the reasons that I show that clip is because having gone into the writer's files of Joan Harrison for Rebecca, and it's one of the few places where, because it's very hard to find any files of Joan Harrison's, but there was one that said writer's files that were specific to Harrison. Harrison actually worked on this script for 18 months. She was the only one who had kind of that role where she oversaw the writing of the script from beginning to end. There were 5 writers on Rebecca. So she also even saw it all the way through post-production, sitting next to David O. Selznick through the editing process when Hitchcock had already moved on to the next film. So she had like that vision, right? That was her role, is to oversee the crucial visionary core of the story. And when you look at what she was working on writing wise, it was actually so intimate, right? And so minute that she would kind of work on like what was written inside the book, the correspondence book of Rebecca, or what happens with the Cupid. And it was scene after scene after scene, and scribbling out, you know, and rewriting notes, having to do with you know, again, very, very, very seemingly trivial interactions, minor dialogue changes. So that's why I'm talking about those kind of charged objects that Joan Harrison seemed obsessed with as well. You know, a fork can become a weapon, a hairbrush can become something overpowering within the house. And she seemed to be quite obsessed with that for well over a year. So I could show you more clips, but I won't. You know, there's another moment, right, where where Joan Fontaine's character kind of stands up to Mrs. De Winter, right? And she says, I am Mrs. De Winter now. And so there's kind of a great kind of twist where she takes back the power. And most of the time you do have this in sometimes in Hitchcock films, but definitely in Joan Harrison films, where you have this realization where the woman kind of comes out of the corner and asserts herself. But I guess to kind of wrap up, and I really do welcome questions and conversation at the end, you know, one of the things that I struggled with while I was writing this book is, of course, this is just one woman's story. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is essentially assert the importance of collaboration, you know, because clearly by focusing so much on, say, the director and the mystique of the director and Alfred Hitchcock's role, we've obscured so many collaborators and the work of collaboration. And yet, if I focus so much on Joan Harrison, you know, I don't want to just replicate kind of the great genius theory and suggest again, you know, that Joan Harrison is just another great genius. And this was one of the tensions that I was working with while I was writing the book. And interestingly, you know, one of the books I thought I would write when I, you know, was thinking about this project was to look at a whole lot of different contributors and to do more of a structural analysis. And as I was finishing this book, another book came out that was called, it's called Nobody's Girl Friday, that basically suggests, right, that there's so many different ways in which women changed the studio system in the 1940s, that you had researchers, union workers, right, seamstresses, and actresses that we don't think of as being so powerful that they literally changed the structures of Hollywood. And that's a wonderful take on the importance of collaboration. And I guess the thing that I would emphasize is that we need to have all of this, right, in all of these perspectives, again, kind of in the mix and in conversation, because there are so many different theoretical lenses. And when they're brought together, it's really quite helpful. And there's another lens, which is also more of the popular kind of sphere. Like I couldn't have done all of my research if it wasn't for all of these websites that pass off as fan sites, but they are archives, right, of information. They are people who have dedicated so much to doing deep, deep research. And they also are developing intellectual communities that are so rich and important. So one thing that I learned in this project is just how important different forms of writing are, right? And different forms of research are. We all know this, but I definitely put this into practice. So thank you for having me. And I'm sure there's like more that I would love to say, but I'm going to cut it off here and invite questions. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks so much. Really great talk that makes one want to go out and buy the book, which I'm sure you'd be happy to have happen. And one sign of the interest is we've already got several questions. And the one I'll start off with is that if you look at the period when Harrison is not working with Hitchcock and had struck out on her own, do we notice any noticeable changes in Hitchcock's work that might reflect her absence?
So there are ways in which, of course, Hitchcock takes a lot of the kind of development and evolution that they had going and continues on with it, right? Continues to apply it. There are also ways in which when Harrison leaves, Alma Revel comes back and begins working with him again. So for example, when Harrison leaves, one of the first films that Hitchcock makes is Shadow of a Doubt, 1943. And Alma Revel is a screenwriter on that film and clearly contributes greatly to Shadow of a Doubt. But moving, further into the 40s, it's not kind of a one-to-one, right? It's not as though that you can see like a major swing as soon as Harrison leaves. I think that a lot of what she does continues to stay because they, you know, one argument, right, one understanding of this is that they continue to remain in conversation. They live just down the street from each other. They emails together and show their work to each other on a weekly basis. So it's not as though there was a major, you know, break. By the late 1940s, Hitchcock actually goes independent. And I think you do begin to see his own interests change to look at other kind of preoccupations and genres.
Thanks. Next question is, in your research and writing, which of the players did you fall in love with and which of the players did you grow to dislike?
Well, gosh, thanks. That's a good question. I don't think that I grew to dislike anybody. You know, it's hard to dislike those that you're writing about. I definitely grew, you know, I guess I did a little bit of that, putting yourself in someone's shoes, right? You know, you have to, for me, I had to do that. I had to identify with the people that I was writing about in order to really take on the story. So I grew to, I grew very fond of Joan Harrison, right? Myself, I understood her failures and her kind of, her own kind of weaknesses, the more that I wrote about her, and really appreciated all of the facets of Joan Harrison. I certainly don't dislike Hitchcock, for example, right? You know, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to villainize Hitchcock or anyone in that kind of orbit. One of the things that was quite interesting, and I think it's a good place to put it right here, is that a huge surprise was kind of a tip that I got from one of Joan Harrison's closest friends who's still living, right? Who's 104 or 105 years old. But he suggested to me that Joan, first of all, had a very, very busy love life, but also that I should probably look into a woman that she had something with, right? Had something important with. And this was really a good line of inquiry, because no matter, there's been a lot of research on Joan Harrison, but just kind of in articles, and no one had ever suggested that she might have, have kind of a bisexual or a lesbian side. And so anyway, one of the things that was quite a surprise is that I managed to find one of her caretakers who said that Joan Harrison's husband, Eric Ambler, the great spy novelist, who Joan married very late in her life, basically revealed, you know, and again, right, you take all this, he kind of came out one day to the caretaker and said, well, you know, Joan, the only person that Joan ever really loved was a woman, right? Close to like a deathbed confession. But what that helped for me is it gave me something to go on to then begin to ask a lot of other people, well, could that be true, right? Could her one true love have been a woman? And who might that have been? And what might that have meant? And when I finally found the person that I think that it was, she turned out to be kind of the villainess in the story. And then I began to wonder, well, why in the world was that the one true love?
Thanks. So the next question is, it sounds like, sorry, did you encounter any pushback in emphasizing Joan Harrison's contributions to Hitchcock's film from Hitchcock enthusiasts?
Did I notice any? So I kind of braced myself for this, you know, only because there are a great deal of people who have studied Hitchcock for a long time, who are kind of protective of Hitchcock, and also just really, I don't think would buy the argument that Joan Harrison had that much of an influence. And so I was worried that I was putting myself out there in the public sphere for attack, you know, that I might be vulnerable by making such, because if you write a book that you're hoping will get picked up by a general audience, you have to make some grand sweeping statements, you know, otherwise what's the point? And I made statements that I believe in, but I needed to kind of make them big. And I thought, well, that's really putting myself out there for potential attack. And the truth is that I haven't had that happen. And I've actually felt that those critics or those, you know, kind of, especially biographers or people who have really written a lot about Hitchcock that I was worried about have been quite supportive. I've been really quite, just, you know, really quite happy with the response.
Okay. And one question was just to ask about the films that she made. And not sure you want to list them all, but is there some place people could go to find out more about her films?
Yeah, so yeah, I won't list them all. Most of them are available, especially if you have something like Criterion, you know, the Criterion channel, or even Netflix, you can find a good number of them. And I highly recommend Phantom Lady is a good place to start. And also They Won't Believe Me is a really interesting film, although you can find that on YouTube. It's, you know, that's kind of in the public domain. And also Ride the Pink Horse. Is a great one, produced and directed by Robert Montgomery, produced by the two of them, and starring Robert Montgomery. All of them are available on DVD.
So some good pandemic watching to keep us busy.
Yeah, and I do want to back up. I'm sorry, I do need to back up to make sure that it's clear when I speak about the potential love interest, female love interest of Joan Harrison's. When I suggest that she was a villainess in the story, it's certainly not to suggest any linkage between her lesbianism and her, you know, her being kind of a negative influence in Joan's life. It just happened to be that a lot of the people who are giving me stories were suggesting that she was causing a lot of havoc, wreaking a lot of havoc. So these were stories that I had to kind of grapple with, right, in terms of how to represent them. Okay, thanks.
But that actually answered the next question, which is why she turned out to be a villainess. I don't know if you want to add anything more, or we should move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think that would be the best way to summarize it. Is she just continually seemed to be a bit of a kind of hurt the people that she kept kind of running into.
Okay. So why was Harrison blacklisted?
So I believe, you know, it was never really obvious, right? I actually got her FBI records to see if there was something that might be explained. And so I believe that she was blacklisted because she was working with writers, a lot of writers who themselves were blacklisted or seen as threats because they were so artistically to the left, you know, and some of them would have been maybe seen as card carrying, you know, right, labeled as card carrying communists. And when everything turned to the Red Scare. And then also she was romantically linked with many people who were caught up in the blacklist. So her name would have been on a lot of lists.
Okay. And the next one is, could you speak to some of the rumors about Hitchcock's mistreatment of women who worked on his films, such as Tippi Hedren? Is there any evidence that Joan Harrison was subjected to this mistreatment? And did she ever express an awareness or concern about Hitchcock's alleged cruelty or the challenges of working as a woman in Hollywood in the 1940s?
I'm so glad that that you asked this question. Thank you. So first, Joan Harrison did have her own troubles, kind of, I'll say separately, right? That once she left Hitchcock, she did walk out of a number of contracts because she felt that she was being, that the power structures were not letting her do what she wanted creatively, but it was clear that sexism was involved. So she left RKO when Howard Hughes issued a memorandum that was just blatantly sexist and meant for her. And she also walked out of a 3-picture deal when she wasn't getting the ending to a film that she wanted. And she clearly thought, well, a male executive wouldn't be getting this treatment. So, and she stood up for other women and made a lot of statements in the press about the importance of basically women in the industry, right? Kind of women's power in the industry. And so given all that, one of the things I find interesting is that I don't believe that she ever found herself in a situation where she was being harassed by Hitchcock, or if she did, she must have put a stop to it very, very quickly. And I, of course, believe every woman's reporting, of their experiences. So I believe what Tippi Hedren says. I thinking that Alfred Hitchcock might have become a slightly different person, in the 1960s from who he was in the 1930s. But I also want to say that one of the things that backs that up is that Joan Harrison seemed to leave the series Alfred Hitchcock Presents and the team of Hitchcock right around the time that Tippi Hedren was reporting all of this, right, in the early 1960s. And Harrison basically kind of gets out of there and moves to Europe. And the show was ending, and there were other reasons why, but she also realized that she was married to Eric Ambler by then, and there was a lot of professional jealousy, or I should say personal jealousy, right, that was creating tension where she just couldn't actually be near Hitchcock while she was married to Ambler. So I think that, she noticed a sexist, right, a kind of a very bothersome sexist element by that time, and she walked out. And I don't know whether she was at the same time standing up for the women behind the scenes.
Well, I think I'll ask one last question. We're past the 9 o'clock time, and obviously anybody can leave if they want, if they have other commitments. But I've been getting so many good questions. I do want to ask one last one. That is, it sounds like Hitchcock was a sort of pioneer in terms of making space for women's voices in screenwriting. This ripple outward to other filmmakers, and I'll add myself, did Harrison's influence have any impact as well?
On other filmmakers.
And supporting women in Hollywood or in filmmaking.
Interesting. So actually, can you rephrase?
So the original question was, it sounds like Hitchcock was a pioneer in terms of making space for women's voices in screenwriting. Did this ripple outwards to other filmmakers? And then I added a more general question about, not about Hitchcock, but about Harrison's influence. Did she create space in her own way?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. So I would say, yeah. So Hitchcock, yes, there's so many, I could list dozens of women, especially if you move beyond screenwriters to kind of women authors that Hitchcock was influenced by and also in constant conversation with. So I think that, that's almost a whole other book talk that I am prepared to give in terms of the women that Hitchcock was influenced by, didn't always give credit to, but really important women's voices. And then Harrison too was actually, I guess the way that I would put it is, she was always looking for material that she could develop for women. Even Joan Fontaine, actually, 5 years after Rebecca, she was, when she saw that Joan Fontaine's career was waning, she tried to help her become an independent producer. And the same thing for Ella Raines. It's one of the reasons she helped with the TV series. But also, as women behind the scenes, she was definitely someone who saw, not that she was a woman alone, right, competing with others, but really trying to hold them up and work together.
Great. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Since the audience can't applaud, I'll applaud for them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's comments and questions.
Well, and
thank you for having me.
Yes, and well, again, thanks for coming, and thanks for everybody for attending. And hopefully we'll see you at our next book talk, and maybe at other books, at other events as well. So with that, good evening, and hope you enjoyed it.